Good morning, everyone. I guess you're wondering why there's an elephant on the slide there. I do like elephants very, very much, but really it's there to remind me of the elephant in the room and to remind you of the elephant in the room, which is, of course, the children themselves and their needs. And I was thinking about, symbolically, what was the best way of representing that character. I'm not going to be talking about young elephants, but young children. And it may be useful when we're talking about all the various things we're talking about in the conference. We're talking about attachment, digital futures, could be gender, could be a multitude of different specialist areas that you're looking at. But sometimes we get so wrapped up in the theory and the methodology that we forget, or we don't think about what are the dimensions that are really going to influence the child. So I'm inviting you really, well, in the next couple of days, to actually imagine a child in the room with you. You know, she's not going to be perhaps so articulate as to say, what's in all of this for me? But, you know, you can imagine that the case. And the best symbolic representation of that concern, in my mind, is in the English context, our common assessment framework, which has had a varied history. It's still used in many local authorities to define the ecological influences on the child, especially children who need special support. And the various areas, the parental capacities, the developmental needs of the child, the general family and environmental factors, this complex ferment of factors, ecological factors in the environment of the child that come together to define, or certainly influence profoundly, the outcomes in terms of learning, development, health, safety, and well-being of every child. So I'm going to come back to this framework because there is an ecological fact of life, I guess, the niche that children are growing up in. And it's not just applicable to children with special needs, it's every single child that we need to consider. But of course, I'm here to talk about sustainable development as well. So I'm not going to give you lots of definitions and go into the details of the challenges we face, but just to remind you that most significantly, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about threats to biodiversity, and they're very complicated as well. They all influence each other and have devastating effects in many cases. And most of our governments have been quite slow to react, partly because it's so expensive, but it's expensive regardless of whether we act or not. Several hundred billions of dollars have already been lost due to catastrophic climate change events over the last few years. And the more that bill adds up, the more urgently that we need to deal with the problems. And in the United Nations, of course, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals that are defining the targets to actually address those multitude of problems. And again, we've got a complex ferment of issues. They're all influencing each other. The poverty is one of the crucial ones, of course, that's unsustainable. But life on land, life beyond land, gender, equality, all of these things impact each other. And Sustainable Development 4 and 4.7 in particular, education for sustainable development, is seen as the key feature that will actually help deliver all of them. So that's quite a responsibility on education. From its earliest definitions from the Brundtland report in the 80s, we understand, and there's a real consensus, that we're talking about development that doesn't have adverse influences on future generations. So right away from the definition, what we're talking about is most applicable to the youngest children in society. They're going to live that future more than anyone else. As citizens, they've got more at stake than anyone else. And if we look at the evidence for climate change effects and environmental a degradation generally, we know from decades of research that young children are the first victims, and they're the worst victims as well of these effects. So there's a huge responsibility to work with children. And then there's the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There's a big consensus, I think, that we include children in determining their own futures. And when we're talking about the futures that are sustainable, then clearly they have a right to be involved in that as well. And that's why we particularly, in the OMEP work that we're doing in the UK, we focus on citizenship. I'll come back to that in a moment. So the case for including education for sustainable citizenship in early childhood really is, I think, very compelling. There's a general consensus that education for sustainable citizenship should be introduced not as an additional curriculum bolt-on, but it should be addressing everything that we do in the setting. Again, I'm going to come back to this, but in the seminar that we're providing this afternoon, it will be a theme that we keep coming back to again there. But I want to argue further than that. I want to argue that our acknowledgement of the importance of education for sustainable citizenship has wider implications than that for everything that we're doing in research, in the next couple of days, in policy making, and in practice in preschools. And I think if we look back at the history of sustainable development, we can see that right from the very beginning, from that Brundtland report, we've recognized that we can't just look at individual disciplinary perspectives. We need to look beyond that. And that's actually encapsulated in this very common model that we apply all the time in sustainable development, the three-pillar model. It's sometimes four pillars because governance is actually included as one as well. What they're actually talking about there is good governance being one of the things, one of the central pillars to support sustainability. We take the position, following Martin Sen and other accounts of philosophical ideas about sustainability, that citizenship actually captures that. So in the definition of education for sustainable citizenship, we just work with the three pillars essentially. But of course, there are so many more of them. All of our subject areas, all of our specialist themes are included in that. I actually don't use, in my training with practitioners and trainers, I don't use the three-pillar model. I prefer to use the idea of a three-legged stool because it's so obvious there that if one leg of the stool is unstable or not apparent, it's going to fall over. It's not sustainable, it's not secure. And that model, that three-position model, right back from the 80s, was, I think, popular amongst policymakers because it actually answered a lot of the problems that we were already facing. Things like public expenditure projects, which were failing. High-rise blocks were the cheapest, the most economic solution to housing in the post-war period. But it had all kinds of drawbacks, environmental and socio-cultural ones. Public transport systems and development sometimes looked at the economic solution without bringing in the others. So actually taking a multidisciplinary perspective is very central to this idea. And in the Brundtland report, they looked more widely. They looked at some of the excesses of overuse of energy, over the pollution, and those effects that were not costed in, those additional effects of these technologies, these consumer goods were not being accounted for. And most significantly in the Brundtland, they identified poverty as unsustainable. And that's obvious, isn't it? I mean, if you need to heat your home or to cook your food and the only fuel available is the local trees, you have to cut them down. If you're starving, you eat your seeds rather than planting them for the next harvest. Poverty is unsustainable. It's obvious at a global level. Perhaps we sometimes forget that it's also true even in developed nations, where fast food is the only affordable thing for many families. Obesity is a big sustainability problem for us. And we use this model when we're talking about consumption, because we need to think of these different dimensions when we make decisions. And we're all aware of some of the decisions we have to make that are different to the ones we made 10 years ago, perhaps, to make our purchasing, our consumption more sustainable. We do that in preschools as well, even with the white goods. And government has taken a role in many countries to give guidance to consumers so that they can make better decisions about energy and about the sustainability of the goods they're buying. We can actually use that as part of our curriculum. Where we make decisions like that in preschool, we can involve the children in that process. We can celebrate the citizenship, the sustainable citizenship actions we're taking collectively. And many of our settings do that. GECO is an organisation in England, in the south of England. Cheryl Hadland's presenting here, I think, on Thursday afternoon. In the TOPS nurseries that she's been running, they've made all kinds of decisions, but most importantly, they're sharing on their website, in the GECO website, lots of examples for other preschools of how they can make their sustainable consumption more effective. And they've pioneered many projects, things like eco-friendly nappies, the reintroduction of real nappies into preschools, and also toilet training to avoid those landfill disasters that are disposable nappies at the moment. But there are so many different decisions that we're making at a day-to-day level in preschools that can be included in this. We can share with parents and with children the sustainable decisions we're making. And of course, we've got all the activities like children involving themselves in growing food, etc. Now, this has become a real consensus within the international guidance on sustainability in the last few years. And I think it's best encapsulated in the flower model of Wilson Mathis. What they say basically is that the way forward in sustainability in preschools and in schools is, first of all, to make sure that you've got an inclusive leadership. You need to involve everyone. You need to involve the teachers, the parents, the children in that, and develop an ethos for sustainability. Not just a curriculum add-on, but actually influencing everything that we do. And what we're talking about there is institutional practices that walk the talk. We're not just talking about how important sustainability is for the future, but actually doing it here and now. Another petal of the flower is our pedagogy. And again, rather than adding more curriculum objectives to an overburdened preschool curriculum already, we need to actually involve it within everything we're doing, so that a play-based practice allows us to see the practitioners to see the opportunities for developing sustainability within whatever it is that the child has chosen to do. And I think in forest school education in particular, that has been pioneered. And in Scandinavia in particular, we've got a lot to learn about how the children are allowed to play freely in those natural environments, with the adult's role being one who observes and supports that play and puts the sustainability spin on it, if you like. Another crucial area is the curriculum. And the curriculum in this sense is co-constructed. It's dialogic between the child and the practitioner. And of course, all of this demands capacity building. It demands teachers being involved in action research projects, in training schemes, and development of this vision is such a big part of that. And starting with the inclusivity, but right the way through the work that we do in sustainable development in preschools. We need to make those community connections. Because if the local library puts solar panels on the building, we should be talking about it with the children in the preschool and taking pride in our local civic community for being good, sustainable citizens. And something that the children and their parents are actually involved in. And as I say, take pride. We want children to identify themselves as sustainable citizens. Education for sustainable development then has always recognized the importance of applying multidisciplinary approaches. What I want to argue is that in recognition of the complex challenges that we are facing, we all need to do that. And I want to promote in particular transdisciplinarity. And incidentally, that word was first coined by Piaget. So it's actually from early childhood perspective that was first developed. He was invited in 1972 by the OECD to advise universities on the problems of teaching and research and interdisciplinarity. And he argued for transdisciplinarity. So what's all that about? I think the easiest way to get to grips with what we're talking about here is to think through a parable. You all know this parable, the blind men and the elephant story. You may not be aware how old it is. It was actually included in the oral teachings of Buddhism and only came into print about 500 BCE. The story sometimes has the blind people coming to blows about the different perspectives that they have. And one person is looking at the tail and thinks it's a rope, another at the trunk and thinks it's a snake. If we think of this from a science perspective, you might imagine that one scientist looks at the elephant through X-ray analysis and through a microscope, and another one with binoculars looking at herd behaviors. Very, very different perspectives. And the instruments that we use, whether they be laboratory instruments like those, or whether they be the theoretical frameworks that we use for analysis, to some extent define or filter at least the perspectives and findings that we make. And that's, you might think of every one of us wearing a pair of spectacles that filters and refracts the way we observe practice through our particular theoretical lenses. Some of us may even look at elephants through rose-tinted spectacles. We might forget that they also have all kinds of special problems sometimes in their upbringing. But the answer to the problems we're suggesting here is to actually bring those different perspectives together. And that's something that Matthias Urban in a recent paper also decided. And I want to say something about this paper because I think it's a very interesting one. What, in scholarship in times of crisis, what he argues is that the global context has radically changed early childhood education. And he's not thinking specifically about sustainable development. He actually says that early childhood education and care is itself a complex system. I started by talking about the individual and their outcomes being defined by a complex ferment of different ecological factors. Well, that's true of the provision of early childhood more generally. And he says that it was especially revealed in the COVID pandemic when, for example, preschools were sometimes closed and workers who were in essential services sometimes were not able to attend their jobs because of the lack of services. Not a concern that generally we consider in early childhood education being a key factor, the employment opportunities that are provided by childcare. He also talks about the inequality within countries, which parallels the inequality that we've been addressing for decades between the global north and south. We've imported a lot of that inequality in many of our societies now. And he talks about how the dominant theoretical and disciplinary traditions of early childhood education and care are not actually meeting those challenges. But you might ask, I'm sure there's lots of you who are very skeptical about this transdisciplinary thing. And one of the ideas that's probably in your mind is, how do you actually talk to other people in very different disciplines? What have you got in common? Is there actually common ground? Matthias Urban, in his paper, refers to, in particular, child development psychology and human capital economics as disciplines he has real problems with. You may consider there are real problems in that respect. And I want to address that directly because Piaget would say that that's not relevant. What we're interested in transdisciplinary discourse is actually looking at the implications of the findings rather than trying to bring together as interdisciplinary activity or multidisciplinary activity a common understanding of the process. My own research training was in the sociology of education. So I rather like Stephen Fuchs' approach to this. What Fuchs says against essentialism is that rather than refuting this argument, we can actually dissolve it, because in fact, what happens in practice is that the idea of a paradigm and incommensurability is only brought in when a particular discipline feels threatened or in competition with another one. And it's actually a sleight of hand, because when we use that argument, we tend to forget that our own subject is just as constructed as the one that we're identifying as ideological. The lesson, he says, to be learned from considering these paradigm struggles is that we actually accept that science isn't the truth of science, but it's the truth of our science, and that we take that more seriously. Urban cites an OECD publication, which I think is quite telling. He talks about how discontent is rising around the world. It's reflecting dysfunctions and injustices that have emerged in economic, social, and cultural systems. And we're all aware of these, aren't we? It's partly to do with sustainable development, but also the pandemic has really drawn attention to it. And the role of science and science advisory committees supporting governments is probably most acutely identified in that context. And Urban calls for a new emphasis on comparative studies. I want to go further than that, because I think it's important to do comparative studies. It's important to look at different contexts for the solutions we're seeking. But I think we need to do more than that. We need to actually look at or address the complexity itself. And this is obvious in many cases with sustainable development. The provisions for life underwater and those on land are obviously interacting enormously. You've got farming, you've got mining, you've got industrial pollution, all affecting the oceans. We have the fisheries and the role of that in world diets, which affects the farming community as well. So, these things influence each other. Climate influences both of them in different ways as well. We cannot just have specialists looking at any of those separate areas. We need to bring them together. And that's that's the role of education, to actually do that. What we're talking about here are complex adaptive systems, what are often referred to as wicked problems, because they don't lend themselves to a simple disciplinary solution. And, there's been a lot written about these. Where we've got complex adaptive systems, it means that there are interdependent parts, just like the SDGs define. Control over the problems and the issues is actually distributed amongst them. We don't know where the effects are coming from all the time. And resolutions, and also the opposite to resolutions, evolve, they emerge from the system. They're not brought in from outside or from the one area. It's a collective thing. And each area is self-organized, it's adaptive, outcomes are not predictable. That's a definition of a wicked problem. And early childhood education is a wicked problem at every level. And the pandemic obviously is a very good example of that, that's drawn our attention to it perhaps more than anything else. Sustainable development also does that. And I'm saying that this ecology of the child, which isn't just about children who have special needs, it's about every single child. Their outcomes are addressed by those. That's why we all, whatever our particular area of discipline or specialism is, we need to be looking back at how it influences the whole, and what we can learn from people looking at other areas, other specialisms as well. One of the symptoms of all of this perceived failure on the public is, of course, that they're more skeptical about science generally. And why should they listen? If scientists can't agree amongst themselves, why should we listen to what anyone says? We can always find somebody else who will argue something else. And that really is a serious issue for us, I think. And it encourages all the misinformation, the conspiracy theories, the scapegoating, the cynical greenwashing and challenges to political correctness. Just this week in England, one of the newspapers picked up on a report on children being excluded from schools because of racist name-calling, perhaps in the playground or in the classroom. And generally speaking, for many years now in England, it's been practiced, if a child is racially abusive to other children, of course, if it's an isolated example, it may be dealt with immediately, but if it's persistent, the parents are called in. Often the child is excluded to ensure that the parents come in, so that we know that they're taking some action, because of course, where did the child get it from? In most cases, it is from the parents, that they're repeating these things. And in this particular newspaper report, it was talking about 60 children a day being excluded, including 4-year-olds. And it didn't talk about exclusion, it talked about being sent home. So in the public's mind, this is fake news. The public's mind, people were imagining 4-year-olds being sent home. You know, maybe there's not a parent there when they get there because they've been racist in the preschool. This is the kind of thing, going back to bans on, purported bans on particular books and storybooks that we've seen in anti-racist practice for many, many years, and the reaction to it. And, you know, we use this word woke in this context. For me, I'm very glad to be awake, and I hope you are too. You know, we're at the wheel. We have to actually be awake and aware of what we're doing. So what's to be done about it? There's well-established means already to think about how we deal with wicked problems. And the biggest one of all probably is to engage all stakeholders in their resolution, to involve everyone. So, you know, that includes us, that includes the academic support that everyone is given in practice as well. And to engage as a research community ever more closely within the political and also public concerns, so that we're addressing what people are interested in and showing that we can come to a common voice. Remember, we're not talking about the same analysis, we're talking about the implications of our research and the commonalities across that is really important here. Another approach, interestingly, that was identified by the Department for Education in England as far back as 2004 is encapsulated in this quotation. With scientific method, we took things apart to see how they work. Now with computers and IT, we can put things back together and see how they work. We can model, and we can deal with this complexity by actually simulating it. Now that was actually a quote by Douglas Adams, the celebrated author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And somehow or other it found its way into the National Curriculum for Science back in 2004, and technology. But it is happening to some extent. You know, it's been a long time coming. AI probably is the most obvious example of that. AI has become a laboratory test bed for cognitive science and for psychologists who are looking at how the mind works. And they're able to model it in technology and test out many of their theories in that way. So it does impact us, and neuroscience in particular is using those kinds of methods. What else can be done about it? The big part of my argument here is that transdisciplinarity is the answer, and it provides a constructive alternative to what is the opposite, which is to critique all the time without being constructive our colleagues' work and their alternative perspectives. It also involves the possibility of presenting research findings in a way that identifies their nuanced context. And if we respect the public, if we respect policymakers to actually make decisions within it, and of course that's necessary for us to be collaborative, then we should embrace that. It provides the possibility of constructive and respectful dialogue with the public. And of course it demands mutual respect. It means that we collaborate. It means that we sometimes suspend our individual questions of belief and compromise. It means that we don't have to be a realist to treat some phenomena as real. You just have to accept that it's real enough for somebody else, that we should respect them and address it. And of course, if you want the philosophical grounding for all that, that's there too. You know, you can look at writings about scientific realism and critical realism to found your perspective on this. But I think it's common sense. It's something we all need to take on board. I started with this common assessment framework. In the English context, it actually came in with the integration, bringing together education and care. And Tony and Chris pioneered this work, really. They carried out some of the very first evaluations that showed how positive and how important the outcomes of integrated services actually were to child outcomes. In 2009, I was invited by the C4EO in England and the Department for Education to do a review of the research evidence on how integration was going across early childhood settings. And the main conclusion that I came to was that there was a need for a clear vision of service integration. It needed to be disseminated and promoted to staff at all levels. This is, you know, after 10 years of work on integration in England that we were finding this. And what we argued in the review was that if integration was to be achieved, then much more needed to be done to encourage integrated thinking amongst the professionals involved. The DFE really didn't like this. They saw it as a criticism of what they were doing at the time and the work that they'd been spearheading. So they did try to edit out a lot of that in the final review, but if you want to have a look at that report, you can see it on my website. What I want to argue here is that if you look at actually those discrete proximal features of determining features of early childhood learning, development, safety, health, well-being, they're all in the Sustainable Development Goals. They're addressing it directly. World of work, the world of the local environment, the international environment, the gender, equality, poverty, all of that is included. So early childhood education could really benefit from adopting a sustainable perspective. It actually has the potential of creating that vision for health workers, for social workers, for educationalists to draw their thinking together and a common language for the development of services, not just for the children in special needs, but for all children. And I want to end with a plug, really. This is an English initiative, but I guess everybody can contribute to it. They've just launched it this year. They're calling it a new era of integration in early childhood. And they've started with a call for evidence on building a sustainable system of integrated family support. The aim of the project is to create a long-term policy plan, 10 years or so, for the development of a new development or more sustained development of integrated services. And I think it's important that we think outside the box. We don't just think about the Sure Start, the special provisions that are made for deprived communities. We talk about all preschools and how we develop a more integrated approach with them. It's actually launched by Nesta, and you'll find those links and actually a draft. I'm not proud. There's a draft of my presentation today on my website. And you'll find the references to what I've been talking about there as well. But I think we've all got a role to play. And I think we can actually start it today with the symposiums this afternoon and start making those connections and start thinking about how does my work actually contribute towards sustainability? Because it all does. You know, if you feel passionate about it enough to do the research, then I guess that it's pretty important. It's probably in there somewhere. Thank you.